So there I was, Captain Jake Morrison, hotshot pilot, and apparently the worst diplomat in human history, sitting in what had to be the galaxy's most pretentious conference room. Picture this: crystal walls that hummed with some kind of cosmic energy, floating chairs that judged your posture, and air that tasted like someone had filtered it through a philosophy textbook. Real classy stuff. The Galactic Harmony Station was supposed to be neutral territory, a shining beacon of interspecies cooperation. What it actually was a floating monument to bureaucratic overreach with a gift shop that sold overpriced meditation crystals. But hey, I was just the delivery boy for humanity's first major peace treaty, so what did I know? Ambassador Vextel sat across from me, all 7 feet of purple dignity, wrapped in robes that probably cost more than my ship. This guy was the kind of alien who color-coordinated his breathing apparatus with his ceremonial headgear. He had these bulbous eyes that never blinked and a mouth that seemed permanently set to disapproving. Think of the most uptight hall monitor you ever met. Give him 4 arms and a superiority complex, and you've got Vextel. Captain Morrison, he said in that voice that sounded like wind chimes having an argument. Your species' reputation for chaos precedes you. I trust you will conduct yourself with appropriate decorum during these sacred proceedings. Sacred proceedings. Right. Like signing a trade agreement was some kind of religious experience. But I nodded anyway, because apparently I was representing all of humanity, and my mom didn't raise me to embarrass the entire species. Well, not intentionally anyway. Chief botanist Quinda hovered nearby, literally. She was one of those floating jellyfish types with about 30 tentacles and a nervous habit of wrapping them around each other when she was stressed. Which, judging by the pretzel she was making of herself, was pretty much constantly. She kept muttering scientific classifications under her breath, like some kind of academic prayer. The ceremonial feast preparations are proceeding according to the Codex of Diplomatic Nutritional Protocols, she announced, each word carefully enunciated, like she was reciting from memory. All consumables have been blessed by the high nutritionist and approved by the Committee for Gastrointestinal Harmony. I swear these people could bureaucratize breathing if you gave them half a chance. The feast hall was impressive, I'll give them that. Tables arranged in some kind of sacred geometry, each place setting equipped with enough silverware to perform surgery, and dishes that looked like abstract art. The food smelled amazing, even if I couldn't identify half of it. There were these little purple things that looked like grapes but moved, and some kind of soup that seemed to be having its own weather system. That's when things went sideways. I reached for what I thought was bread. Turns out it was the sacred loaf of eternal sustenance, or some equally ridiculous name. The moment my fingers touched it, every alien in the room went dead silent. Vextel's eyes went wide, Quinda's tentacles froze mid-flutter, and somewhere in the back I swear I heard someone gasp in 17 different languages. You have committed the ultimate transgression, Vextel whispered, his voice carrying the kind of horror usually reserved for announcing the end of the universe. You have defiled the sacred sustenance with your unworthy appendages. Unworthy appendages. He was talking about my hands like they were toxic waste dispensers. It's bread, I said, because apparently I have a death wish. I was hungry. The room erupted. Aliens were chittering, clicking and making sounds that my translator couldn't even attempt to render into English. Quinda was having what looked like a nervous breakdown, her tentacles flailing in patterns that probably spelled out botanical curse words. Vextel stood up, his robes billowing dramatically. The sacred codex is clear. When the food has been defiled by ignorance, all nourishment must be forbidden until the spirits of sustenance have been appeased. 5 days of fasting for all participants. 5 days, no food, for everyone. I looked around the room at about 30 aliens who were all staring at me like I'd just kicked their collective puppy. So let me get this straight, I said, because my mouth apparently operates independently of my brain. Because I touched your magic bread, nobody gets to eat for 5 days. That is correct, Vextel said with the kind of satisfaction that suggested he thought he'd just delivered the ultimate punishment. Your species will learn proper respect for galactic customs. I sat back in my floating chair and tried not to laugh. 5 days without food, and they thought this was going to break me. These aliens clearly hadn't done their homework on human history. We were the species that invented the concept of starving artist and turned it into a lifestyle choice. Well, I said, looking around at their expectant faces, I guess we're about to find out who's tougher than they look. The smug satisfaction on Vextel's face was almost worth the diplomatic incident. Almost. This was going to be interesting. Day 1 of the Great Starvation Challenge, and I had to admit, the aliens were putting on a good show. Vextel strode through the diplomatic quarters like he was leading a righteous crusade, his robes swishing with the kind of authority that said I have never missed a meal in my life, but I'm totally prepared to suffer for my principles. The other delegates were rallying behind him with the enthusiasm of people who had never actually been hungry. There was Ambassador Trilk, who looked like a walking tree but with worse social skills, nodding his branch-like appendages in solemn agreement. Commander Zephyx, the military representative who resembled a chrome-plated lobster, was clicking his claws together in what I assumed was approval. Even the trade negotiator, a blob of sentient jelly called Negotiator Prime, was wobbling with what might have been determination. "This human will learn the folly of disrespecting our sacred customs," Vextal announced to his little gathering of supporters. 5 days without sustenance will humble even the most arrogant species. I watched this performance from my assigned quarters, which were basically a luxury prison cell with a view of the hydroponics bay. Speaking of which, that view was starting to look pretty interesting. The station's botanical section stretched out below my window like some kind of alien garden center, complete with plants that probably had names longer than my service record. Quinda floated past my door for the 3rd time in an hour, her tentacles wrapped so tightly around each other she looked like she was trying to strangle herself. Poor thing was clearly having second thoughts about this whole punishment deal, but was too nervous to speak up. Every time she passed, she'd glance at the hydroponic gardens and then at me, like she was calculating something. "You know," I called out to her during her 4th lap, "those are some impressive plants down there." She froze mid-float, her tentacles quivering. They are not for consumption. They are research specimens, and pest control subjects, and decorative elements, definitely not food." The way she said it made me think she was trying to convince herself as much as me. I pressed my face against the window and made a show of studying the gardens below. "That's a shame. Some of those weeds look pretty hardy." "Weeds?" Her voice went up about 3 octaves. "Those are not weeds. They are carefully cultivated specimens of galactic flora, each one catalogued and categorized according to the Universal Botanical Index." "Huh." I squinted at what looked suspiciously like dandelions growing between the fancy alien plants. "Where I come from, we call those weeds." Quinda's tentacles started twitching in a pattern that my translator helpfully identified as extreme scientific distress. She floated closer to the window, following my gaze. "You cannot possibly be suggesting that the Taraxacum galacticus specimens are edible." Taraxacum galacticus. They had given dandelions a fancy Latin name and were growing them in space. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. "Oh, I'm not suggesting anything," I said innocently. "I'm just saying, back on Earth my grandmother used to make a mean dandelion salad. Great source of vitamins." The sound that came out of Quinda could best be described as a scientific scream. She floated away so fast she left a trail of disturbed air particles. But here's the thing about humans, that these aliens clearly hadn't figured out. We're curious. It's what got us to the stars in the first place, and it's what was going to get me through the next 5 days. While Vextal was busy holding court about the nobility of suffering, I was doing what humans do best, figuring out how to survive. The station's environmental systems were impressive, but they were also familiar. Oxygen recycling, water purification, waste management, and of course the hydroponics bay that was supposed to keep everyone fed during long diplomatic missions. The problem was, all the official food was locked away tighter than a politician's campaign promises. But those plants growing wild between the official crops, the ones Quinda kept insisting were pest control subjects and decorative elements, those were fair game. I spent the rest of day 1 taking what I like to call contemplative walks around the station. Just a human, stretching his legs, definitely not cataloging which plants looked familiar, and which ones were growing in areas where a guy might hypothetically harvest them without being noticed. By evening, while the aliens were gathering for their first official Hunger Solidarity meeting, I was back in my quarters with a small collection of what any Earth botanist would recognize as perfectly edible plants. Clover, plantain, something that looked exactly like wild garlic, and yes, those fancy Taraxacum galacticus specimens that were definitely just space dandelions. The irony wasn't lost on me. These aliens had put together the most advanced agricultural facility in the galaxy, complete with perfect growing conditions and sophisticated hydroponic systems. Then they'd filled it with weeds, and called it science. From my window, I could see Vextal leading the evening's fast of noble suffering, his forearms spread wide as he addressed the increasingly hollow-eyed gathering. Even from here, I could see that some of the delegates were already looking a little peaked. Trilk's leaves were starting to droop, and Commander Zephyx's chrome plating didn't look quite as shiny as it had this morning. Meanwhile, I was sitting in my quarters, quietly munching on what was essentially a space salad, thinking about how my grandmother always said the best meals were the ones you had to work for. Tomorrow was going to be very interesting indeed. Day 2 of what I was now calling the Great Galactic Fast. and the cracks were starting to show. Not in me, obviously. I woke up feeling pretty good, all things considered. Maybe it was the space dandelion salad. Or maybe it was just the satisfaction of watching a plan come together. The aliens, on the other hand, were looking rough. Vextol still had his dignity, but his robes were hanging a little looser, and his usual perfect posture had developed what I'd charitably call a slight slump. Trilk was definitely drooping now, his bark-like skin looking dull, and his branch arms moving with the enthusiasm of wet spaghetti. Commander Zephix's chrome plating had lost its mirror shine, and was showing what looked suspiciously like stress fractures. But the real entertainment was watching Negotiator Prime. Yesterday they'd been a confident blob of righteous jelly. Today they looked like someone had let half the air out of them. Every time they tried to maintain their usual imposing spherical shape, they'd sag a little more around the edges. The second day is always the most challenging, Vextol announced during the morning's Solidarity Suffering session, his voice only slightly less commanding than usual. But we must remain strong in the face of this test. The human will surely be begging for mercy soon. I chose that moment to walk past their little gathering, heading for what I was now thinking of as my morning constitutional. The key to good foraging is looking casual, like you're just out for a stroll and definitely not planning to raid the local ecosystem for breakfast. Good morning, everyone, I called out cheerfully. Beautiful day for a fast, isn't it? The look Vextol gave me could have stripped paint. You seem remarkably energetic for someone experiencing nutritional deprivation. Oh, you know how it is, I said with a shrug. Montana farm boys are pretty hardy. My dad always said we could survive on fresh air and stubbornness if we had to. That wasn't entirely a lie. Growing up on a cattle ranch does teach you a thing or two about making do with what you have. It also teaches you that the line between weed and emergency food source is a lot thinner than most people think. I continued my walk, leaving behind a group of increasingly suspicious aliens. The hydroponics bay was my first stop, as usual. The official crops were still locked away behind security barriers that would make Fort Knox jealous, but the pest plants growing in every corner and crack were practically begging to be harvested. Here's something they don't teach you in diplomatic corps training. Humans have been eating weeds for about as long as we've been human. What everyone else calls invasive species, we call lunch. Those space dandelions, perfect for a morning salad. The clover-looking stuff growing around the water recyclers, high in protein and tastes like home. And that wild garlic sprouting near the air filtration units. Well, that was going to make everything else taste a whole lot better. The maintenance areas were even better. Apparently the station's designers had never heard of companion planting, because their carefully controlled agricultural zones were overrun with what any Earth farmer would recognize as perfectly good food. Lamb's quarters, purslane, amaranth, and what looked like 3 different types of edible mushrooms growing in the damp spots near the air scrubbers. I was starting to think these aliens had never experienced actual scarcity. They'd built the most advanced space station in the galaxy, and then populated it with a survivalist's dream buffet, all because they thought anything that grew without permission was pest contamination. By midday, I was back in my quarters with enough foraged greens to make a respectable stir-fry. The only problem was cooking it without being obvious about it. Fortunately, my quarters came equipped with what the aliens called an emergency atmospheric processing unit, and what I called a hot plate with delusions of grandeur. The smell of garlic and wild greens cooking was probably not the smartest move, strategically speaking, but a man's got to eat. Besides, I was curious to see how long it would take someone to notice. The answer was about 10 minutes. Quinda appeared at my door like she'd been shot out of a cannon, all 30 tentacles quivering with what I was learning to recognize as her version of panic. Captain Morrison, I am detecting unusual atmospheric compounds emanating from your quarters. Are you cooking something? Just having a little snack, I said, taking a deliberate bite of what was essentially space salad with sautéed wild garlic. You know, to keep my strength up. Her tentacles went rigid. That is impossible. All nutritional resources have been secured. There is no food available on this station. Well, I said, chewing thoughtfully, that depends on your definition of food, doesn't it? I could practically see the gears turning in her scientific brain. She floated closer, her sensors probably analyzing every molecule of air around my quarters. Those aromatic compounds, they are consistent with processed plant matter, specifically processed plant matter from species that are growing all over your station, I suggested helpfully. The sound she made was like a tea kettle, having an existential crisis. Those are not food sources. They are catalogued as pest species, invasive flora and maintenance complications. They are not intended for consumption. Funny thing about that, I said, taking another bite. Back on Earth we've got a saying, One man's weed is another man's salad. Quinda's tentacles started doing something that looked like sign language for complete scientific breakdown. She floated there for a moment processing this information, then suddenly zipped away so fast she left a wake of disturbed air. I finished my meal in peace, wondering how long it would take for word to spread. The answer, as it turned out, was not long at all. By evening I could see small groups of aliens having intense whispered conversations. Vextel was maintaining his dignity, but even he kept glancing in my direction with something that might have been concern, or hunger. With aliens it's sometimes hard to tell the difference. Day 3 was going to be even more fun, especially since I'd spotted what looked like wild berries growing near the waste processing center, and my grandmother always said that any fruit growing near a compost pile was bound to be extra nutritious. These aliens had no idea what they were dealing with, but they were about to find out. Day 3 and 4 blurred together into what I can only describe as the most entertaining diplomatic crisis of my career. The aliens were starting to look like extras from a zombie movie, while I was having the time of my life playing Galactic survivalist. Vextal had given up on his morning dignity walks and was now spending most of his time slumped in what used to be his throne-like chair, staring at nothing with the hollow-eyed expression of someone who was beginning to question his life choices. His robes, which had been perfectly pressed monuments to bureaucratic vanity, now hung on him like colorful curtains on a scarecrow. Trilk wasn't even pretending to be mobile anymore. The tree-like ambassador had rooted himself in the corner of the main conference room and was just standing there. Occasionally one of his branch arms would twitch, but that was about it. I was starting to worry he might actually be photosynthesizing, which would be cheating, but also kind of impressive. Commander Zephix was making clicking sounds that my translator had given up trying to interpret, settling for helpful labels like distressed chittering and possibly profane crustacean noises. His chrome plating now looked like it had been through a meteor shower, all dull and pitted with stress marks. And Negotiator Prime, let's just say they'd gone from imposing blob of authority to sad puddle of bureaucratic jelly. They'd tried to maintain their usual spherical dignity, but physics and hunger had other plans. Now they looked like someone had left a balloon out in the sun too long. Meanwhile I was thriving. The wild berry patch near the waste processing center had turned out to be a gold mine. The berries tasted like a cross between blueberries and something vaguely tropical, and there were enough of them to make a decent fruit salad. Combined with the various greens I'd been harvesting, I was eating better than I had in months. But the real breakthrough came when I discovered the mushroom colony growing in the lower maintenance tunnels. I was doing my usual morning forage when I spotted what looked like oyster mushrooms growing on some kind of alien wood substrate near the air recycling systems. Back home we'd always been taught to be careful with wild mushrooms, but these looked exactly like varieties I'd grown up eating. And more importantly, they smelled right. There's something about edible fungi that just smells like food if you know what to look for. I was in the middle of harvesting what had to be about 3 pounds of prime mushrooms when I heard the telltale sound of Quinda's nervous tentacle fluttering behind me. "Captain Morrison," she said, her voice carrying the kind of scientific horror usually reserved for discovering that someone had been using the particle accelerator as a coffee maker. "Please tell me you are not about to consume those fungal specimens." I turned around, my arms full of what was going to be an excellent mushroom stir-fry, and found myself face to face with a very distressed alien botanist. Her tentacles were wrapped around a datapad that was beeping frantically, and her usual nervous energy had been cranked up to 11. "These?" I said, holding up a particularly nice specimen. "They're just mushrooms, perfectly safe, as far as I can tell." Perfectly safe. Her voice went so high-pitched that my translator gave up and just displayed a series of question marks. "Those are Pleurotus lethalis specimens, the most toxic fungal species in this sector of the galaxy. They are capable of causing immediate organ failure in 97% of known species." I looked at the mushroom in my hand. It looked like every oyster mushroom I'd ever seen. It smelled like an oyster mushroom. And unless I was very much mistaken, it was an oyster mushroom that had been given a scary Latin name by aliens who had apparently never heard of field guides. "Huh," I said. "Well, that's interesting." Interesting. Quinda's tentacles were now making patterns that looked like they were spelling out prayers to various scientific deities. "Captain Morrison, you cannot possibly be considering consuming those death caps." "Death caps are a completely different species," I said automatically, then realized I'd probably just made things worse. "Look, I appreciate the concern, but I've been eating mushrooms like these since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. My dad taught me how to identify them when I was 8. Your father taught you to identify lethal toxins as a child." The way she said it made it sound like I'd been raised by a cult of poison enthusiasts. "He taught me to identify food," I corrected. There's a difference. I could see her scientific worldview cracking in real time. Everything she'd learned about galactic flora classification was telling her that what I was holding would kill me in about 15 minutes. Everything she was observing was telling her that I'd been eating similar specimens for days and was healthier than any other sentient being on the station. This is impossible, she muttered, her tentacles moving in what I was beginning to recognize as her version of pacing. The spectral analysis clearly indicates the presence of compounds that should be lethal to carbon-based life forms. Maybe your spectral analysis needs calibration, I suggested, taking a deliberate bite of raw mushroom. It tasted exactly like it was supposed to, earthy, slightly nutty, with just a hint of the recycled air that had been feeding it. Quinda made a noise that sounded like a smoke detector having a nervous breakdown. Look, I said, sitting down on a convenient maintenance crate. Let me explain something about humans. We're what you might call generalist omnivores. We evolved eating pretty much anything that didn't eat us first. Plants, animals, fungi, you name it. Our digestive systems are basically biological garbage disposals with very few standards. That is the most terrifying thing I have ever heard, she whispered. Gets better, I continued, warming to the subject. We also evolved alongside most of these plants. What you call Taraxacum galacticus, we call dandelions. What you call Pleurotus lethalis, we call oyster mushrooms. Your scary toxic death plants are just Tuesday lunch where I come from. I could practically see the gears turning in her head as she processed this information. Her datapad was beeping frantically, probably trying to reconcile the fact that I should be dead with the fact that I was sitting there having a casual conversation about comparative evolutionary biology. You are saying, she said slowly, that your species has biological compatibility with flora that is toxic to the rest of galactic civilization. Well, when you put it like that, it sounds kind of impressive, I said with a grin. But yeah, pretty much. We're like the galactic equivalent of goats. We can eat almost anything organic and probably thrive on it. The look on her face was priceless. It was the expression of someone whose entire understanding of the universe had just been turned upside down and shaken until all the loose change fell out. I need to run tests, she said suddenly. Extensive tests. This could revolutionize our understanding of interspecies nutritional compatibility. Knock yourself out, I said, standing up with my arms full of mushrooms. But if you want to see really revolutionary, you should stick around for dinner. I'm thinking mushroom and wild green stir-fry with a side of berry compote. She floated there for a moment, watching me head back toward my quarters with enough foraged food to feed a small army. Then she zipped away, muttering what sounded like scientific prayers in at least 3 languages. By the time I got back to my quarters, word had already started to spread. Through my window, I could see small groups of increasingly desperate aliens having what looked like very intense discussions. Some of them kept glancing up at my quarters, and I was pretty sure I knew what they were talking about. The Great Galactic Fast was about to become a lot more complicated. Day 4 dawned with what I can only describe as the sweet sound of alien desperation. It started with a tentative knock on my door, which was unusual because most of the diplomatic staff had been avoiding me like I was carrying some kind of human plague. I opened the door to find Commander Zephyx standing there, or rather hunching there. The proud military officer who had been clicking his claws in righteous approval just 3 days ago now looked like a chrome-plated scarecrow that had been left out in a hailstorm. His usually pristine exoskeleton was dull and pitted, and there was a distinct tremor in his appendages that suggested his blood sugar was somewhere south of functional. Captain Morrison, he said, his voice carrying all the authority of a deflated balloon, I have come to inquire about your continued well-being. Translation, he wanted to know how I wasn't dead yet. Doing great, Commander, I said cheerfully, taking a bite of what I'd started calling my breakfast berry bowl. Never felt better, actually. How about you? The look he gave the berries in my hand was the kind of longing usually reserved for lost loves and distant homeworlds. Those appear to be Toxicus purpuralis specimens, consumption of which results in immediate cardiac arrest in Zephyrian physiology. Yeah, Quinda mentioned something like that about the mushrooms yesterday, I said, popping another berry in my mouth. Funny how things work out. His claws were twitching now, and I could hear his translator working overtime trying to process what was probably a very complex series of military oaths. Captain Morrison, I must ask, how is it that you are not only surviving but apparently thriving on a diet of what our science identifies as lethal toxins? Before I could answer, Trilk came shuffling around the corner, and I mean shuffling. The tree-like ambassador who had spent the last day rooted in the conference room had apparently decided that dignity was less important than finding out why the human wasn't starving to death like he was supposed to. The human consumes death plants, Trilk said in a voice that sounded like wind through dying leaves. The human grows stronger while we weaken. The human violates the natural order. Well, when you put it like that, I sound pretty badass, I said. But really it's just basic biology. Humans evolved as opportunistic omnivores. What you guys call poison, we call breakfast. That's when Negotiator Prime came oozing around the corner, looking like a deflated beach ball with delusions of grandeur. They'd given up entirely on maintaining their usual imposing spherical shape and were now more of a diplomatic pancake with attitude problems. Explain, they wheezed, their usual smooth negotiating voice reduced to something that sounded like air escaping from a dying balloon. Explain how your species violates galactic nutritional science. I looked at the three of them. A chrome-plated lobster having a nervous breakdown, a tree that was probably considering autumn as a lifestyle choice, and a blob that looked like it needed emergency reinflation, and realized this was the moment everything changed. Okay, I said, settling back against my doorframe. Pop quiz time. What do you call a plant that grows fast, spreads everywhere, and is really hard to kill? Invasive pest flora, Trilk said automatically. Exactly. And what do you call a species that spreads to every available habitat, adapts to local conditions, and is really hard to kill? There was a pause as the implications sank in. Oh, said Commander Zephyx in a voice that suggested several pieces had just fallen into place. That's right, I said with a grin. Humans are the invasive pest flora of the sentient species world. And just like your weeds, we're really good at eating whatever's available and thriving in conditions that would kill more specialized species. Negotiator Prime made a sound that was probably supposed to be dignified but came out more like a deflating tire. You are saying that your species has biological compatibility with pest organisms because you are, essentially, pest organisms yourselves. Hey now, I said, that's a little harsh. We prefer adaptable generalists. But yeah, basically. You want to know the real kicker? All those plants you've been carefully cataloging as deadly toxins, most of them are probably Earth species that hitched a ride on human ships and colonized your fancy space stations. You're not dealing with alien death plants, you're dealing with Earth weeds that found a nice place to live. The silence that followed was the kind of quiet you get when someone's entire worldview collapses and lands in a heap. The dandelions, Quinda's voice came floating down the corridor as she approached at maximum hover speed, are genetically identical to Terran Taraxecum officinale. The mushrooms are Pleurotus austratus, the berries are Vaccinium species variants. She arrived in a flutter of agitated tentacles, clutching her datapad like it held the secrets of the universe. Which in a way it did. I have been running comparative genetic analysis all night, she announced breathlessly. 73% of our cataloged deadly invasive species show genetic markers consistent with Terran flora. Your planet's plants have been colonizing our facilities for decades. And we never noticed, Commander Zephyx said slowly, because we assumed anything that grew without permission was automatically dangerous. While humans, Trilk added with what might have been admiration, saw familiar food and started snacking. The four aliens stood there, well, three stood and one oozed processing this revelation. I took another bite of berries and waited for the next shoe to drop. It came in the form of Vextol, who came stumbling around the corner looking like 7 feet of purple dignity that had been put through a blender set to diplomatic crisis. His usually perfect robes were wrinkled, his posture had devolved into something that could charitably be called upright, and his bulbous eyes had developed the kind of hollow stare that suggested he was questioning every life choice that had led him to this moment. I have come, he said, in a voice that carried all the authority of wet cardboard, to inquire about the possibility of nutritional consultation. And there it was. The proud alien ambassador who had been so confident about teaching humanity a lesson was asking me for food advice. Well, I said, savoring the moment, I suppose I could share a few tips. But first, don't you think we should discuss the terms of this whole peace treaty situation? I mean, it seems like there might be room for some renegotiation. The look on Vextol's face was priceless. Pride, hunger, desperation, and the dawning realization that he had completely misjudged the situation all fought for control of his expression. Pride lost. What did you have in mind? He asked, his diplomatic training finally kicking in despite his obvious distress. Oh, nothing too complicated, I said, casually. Better trade terms for human agricultural exports, maybe some mutual defense agreements, and definitely a clause about respecting species-specific dietary adaptations and future diplomatic protocols. I paused to take another bite of berries, letting them think about it. Plus, I added, I think humanity deserves an official apology for this whole starve them into submission thing. Bad form, really. Vextol's shoulders sagged, but he nodded. Those terms seem reasonable. Great, I said brightly. Now, who wants to learn how to make dandelion salad? The stampede of desperate aliens trying to crowd into my quarters was probably the most undignified thing that had ever happened in galactic diplomatic history. and I loved every minute of it. Day 5 arrived with all the pomp and circumstance of a birthday party that everyone had forgotten about. Technically, this was supposed to be the grand finale of the Great Punishment Fast, the moment when the starving humans would crawl before the mighty Galactic Alliance and beg for forgiveness. Instead, it was more like a cooking show where the audience was a bunch of hangry aliens who had just discovered that their entire understanding of nutrition was fundamentally flawed. My quarters had been transformed into what could only be described as an interspecies survival school. Vextal sat in the corner, his once pristine robes now rolled up to his elbows as he carefully sorted through a pile of what he was learning to call edible weeds instead of deadly invasive toxins. His forearms moved with the methodical precision of someone who had discovered that pride was significantly less filling than dandelion greens. Commander Zephyx had stationed himself near the window, using his military tactical skills to map out the best foraging locations around the station. His chrome plating was still dull, but there was a new gleam in his compound eyes that suggested he was starting to see the strategic advantages of a species that could literally eat the scenery. Trilk had rooted himself in the best spot for photosynthesis while taking detailed notes on plant identification. Apparently, being part plant himself gave him some insights into which specimens were likely to be nutritious versus merely edible. Who knew that diplomatic training would eventually include lessons in botanical survival tactics? Negotiator Prime had managed to reinflate themselves enough to hover at table height, where they were attempting to practice what I'd taught them about proper berry selection. It turns out that when you're basically a sentient blob, fine motor control becomes a real challenge when you're trying to distinguish between ripe and overripe fruit. And Quinda? She was in full scientific discovery mode, furiously taking notes on everything from preparation techniques to the long-term nutritional implications of what she was now calling cross-species dietary adaptation protocols. Her tentacles moved so fast they were basically a blur, as she documented every detail of what was probably going to become the most revolutionary paper in xenobotanical history. The key I was explaining while demonstrating proper mushroom cleaning technique is understanding that just because something grows wild doesn't mean it's dangerous. Most of these plants are actually trying to be eaten. That's how they spread their seeds. Fascinating, Quinda muttered, her tentacles scribbling notes at light speed. So the plants have evolved to be consumed as part of their reproductive strategy, but our classification systems categorized them as hostile because we assumed any uncontrolled growth was automatically threatening. Pretty much, I said, tossing a cleaned mushroom into the communal salad bowl that had somehow materialized in the middle of this diplomatic incident. Classic case of overthinking the problem. Vextal looked up from his careful examination of what he was slowly accepting was just space clover. Captain Morrison, I must ask, how long has your species possessed this knowledge? Which part? I asked. The part about plants being food, or the part about not starving to death when there's perfectly good vegetation growing everywhere? Both, he said quietly. I paused in my mushroom prep to think about it. Well, humans have been foraging for about 200,000 years give or take. It's kind of our thing. As for not starving when surrounded by edible plants, I shrugged. That's just common sense where I come from. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Here were some of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy, and they'd been defeated by a farm boy from Montana who knew which weeds were good in salad. Your people, Commander Zephyx said slowly, have been eating what we consider deadly toxins for 200 millennia. Well, when you put it like that, it sounds pretty metal, I admitted. But really, it's just Tuesday on Earth. My grandmother probably had more practical botanical knowledge than your entire scientific establishment. That got me some looks that ranged from impressed to terrified. Speaking of which, I continued, you might want to revise some of your planetary classification systems. If Earth plants are colonizing your stations this effectively, they're probably doing the same thing on habitable worlds throughout human space. What you've been calling ecological contamination might actually be dinner for any human colonists. Quinda's note-taking intensified to the point where I was worried she might achieve tentacle combustion. The implications for terraforming and colonization efforts are staggering, she said breathlessly. Human agricultural systems could transform worlds that we've classified as unsuitable for habitation. Or, said Negotiator Prime in a voice that was still wheezier than usual but carried a definite note of interest, human colonists could thrive on worlds where our surveys indicate there are insufficient food resources to support civilization. I could practically see the gears turning in their heads as they processed the strategic implications. Humans weren't just another species to be managed through diplomatic protocol. We were a biological wild card that could potentially thrive anywhere there was organic matter and breathable atmosphere. This changes everything, Vextal said, his voice carrying the kind of awe usually reserved for religious experiences or really good tax breaks. Yeah, I said, adding some of the berries to our improvised feast, that's kind of what I've been trying to tell you. The official end of the 5-day fast was marked not with ceremony, but with the most unusual diplomatic banquet in galactic history. The menu consisted entirely of what had been classified as station pest flora 24 hours earlier, prepared according to recipes that my grandmother would have recognized and approved of. Vextal made a formal apology on behalf of the Galactic Alliance, acknowledging that the punishment had been based on incomplete understanding of human biological capabilities and cultural dietary practices. Which was diplomatic speak for we had no idea you could eat literally anything and we're sorry we tried to starve you. The new treaty terms were significantly more favorable to humanity than the original proposal. Trade agreements that recognized human agricultural expertise, mutual defense pacts that acknowledged human adaptability as a strategic asset, and a formal protocol for respecting species-specific survival capabilities in future diplomatic interactions. But the real victory was watching Commander Zephyx take his first bite of dandelion and wild mushroom salad and admit that it actually tasted pretty good. You know, he said thoughtfully, his chrome plating starting to show the first hints of its former shine, this could revolutionize military field rations. Welcome to human cuisine, I said with a grin. We've been turning weeds into dinner since before we invented fire. As I packed up to leave the station, Quinda floated over with her datapad clutched in all 30 tentacles. Captain Morrison, she said, I have been authorized to offer you a position as chief consultant for our new interspecies nutritional compatibility research division. Tempting, I said, but I think I'll stick to flying freight. Though I appreciate the offer. Before you go, she said, I must ask, what would you call a species that can survive and thrive in any environment, adapt to local conditions, and turn any available organic matter into sustenance? I thought about it for a moment, then smiled. Successful. As my ship lifted off from the Galactic Harmony station, I could see through the viewport that they'd already started cultivating some of the pest plants in official agricultural bays. The dandelions were going to love the extra attention. My final report to Earth Command was probably the shortest diplomatic summary in human history. Mission accomplished. Humans are officially recognized as the weeds of the galaxy. We're proud of it. Treaty terms exceeded expectations. Also, pack more hot sauce next time. Sometimes the best diplomacy is just being yourself. Even if yourself happens to be a species that can eat anything, survive anywhere, and turn a punishment into a cooking lesson. Especially then.